Elijah Hayes, a black doctor in the small town of Maple Grove, faces systemic racism and corruption when he uncovers a conspiracy involving local officials, including Officer Grayson and Councilman Kline. Despite his professionalism, Elijah is mistreated and unfairly targeted due to his race, enduring microaggressions, wrongful accusations, and attempts to silence him. As the town's deep-seated prejudices surface, Elijah's struggle for justice becomes a dangerous battle against powerful figures who use their positions to exploit and oppress marginalized communities. The stakes rise as Elijah confronts these corrupt forces, risking everything to expose the truth. Dr. Elijah Hayes adjusted his cufflinks as he stepped out of his car, a modest black sedan. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow across the quiet street, lined with small businesses. For anyone walking by, Elijah might have looked like any regular man. His crisp blue dress shirt and tailored slacks were understated. He preferred it that way. Humility had been his armor for years, even when success came knocking at his door. Elijah wasn't just a man in a nice shirt. He was the founder of Hayes Health Innovations, a medical technology company that had saved countless lives with affordable devices for rural hospitals. His work earned him awards, praise from presidents, and invitations to international conferences. Yet here he was, slipping into an unassuming afternoon, unnoticed and unremarkable. Elijah liked to keep things simple. The big houses, flashy cars, and the excessive displays of wealth never appealed to him. Instead, he focused on his work, his family, and his purpose. People told him he was a man of quiet power, but Elijah didn't think much of it. To him, power was in action, solving problems, helping those who needed it most. He had come back to this small town, Maple Grove, for one reason: to build a clinic. Years ago, his mother had died in a clinic not far from here, in a crumbling room that lacked the most basic medical supplies. The memory of it had driven him for decades. Now, the clinic he'd funded and designed was just weeks away from opening, and his presence here felt almost poetic. As Elijah locked his car and made his way down the street, he took in the familiar sights. The family-owned diner on the corner, the barber shop with the same striped pole spinning lazily outside Maple Grove hadn't changed much. That was both its charm and its curse. Beneath the smiles of its tight-knit community were tensions that lingered like smoke from a forgotten fire. Elijah knew it well. Small towns rarely forgot, and they rarely forgave. He turned into a small boutique, its clean glass windows boasting luxury leather goods that seemed out of place in a town like this. Elijah wasn't here for anything extravagant. He wanted to pick up a gift, something simple, for one of the nurses joining his clinic. She had helped coordinate the hiring process for his staff, working late hours without ever asking for thanks. Inside, the store was quiet, the kind of silence that pressed down on your shoulders, like you didn't belong. Elijah noticed it immediately, but brushed it off. A young thin woman behind the counter looked up from her phone. She was blonde, her sleek bob cut sharp against her cheekbones. Her expression shifted quickly as she looked him up and down. "Hello," Elijah said warmly, offering a smile. "I'm looking for a leather planner or notebook, something simple if you have it." The woman hesitated, her lips twitching into a polite, stiff smile. "Those are pretty pricey," she said. Her eyes lingered on his shoes, polished but plain, as if they told her everything she needed to know. Elijah's smile faltered for a brief second. "That's fine," he replied, still calm. He had dealt with this kind of thing before, the way certain people sized him up, trying to place him in a box that made sense to them. A well-dressed black man in a luxury boutique in a town like this, it didn't add up for some folks. "I don't think we have anything in your price range," she added quickly, her voice clipped, betraying a hint of irritation. Elijah raised an eyebrow. He glanced at the polished shelves behind her, where leather planners were neatly arranged in rows. "I'm pretty sure you do," he said, keeping his voice steady. There was no anger in his tone, no edge, just an unsettling calm that threw people off more than shouting ever could. The woman stiffened, her hand instinctively moving to smooth down her shirt. "We're closing soon," she said, clearly flustered now. "Maybe you should try a place that's more your style." Her emphasis on the last three words wasn't subtle. It hung in the air like a sour note. Elijah sighed internally. This wasn't new. He had spent years navigating spaces where his presence felt like a challenge to the people around him. Boardrooms, conferences, gala events, places where people assumed his seat must have been given, not earned. It was an exhausting dance, one that he often handled with a smile and a bit of grace, but today, it stung. This woman didn't know his name, his achievements, or what he'd done for this town. To her, he was just another black man who didn't belong in a store like this. He took a step back, running his hand along his jaw, his expression thoughtful. He wasn't going to raise his voice or give her the satisfaction of an argument, but he also wasn't about to slink away quietly. "Do you own this store?" Elijah asked suddenly, his eyes fixed on hers. The woman blinked. "No," she said defensively. "But that's irrelevant." "Who does?" Elijah pressed, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Mr. Wallace owns it," she snapped. "He wouldn't sell to—" She stopped herself mid-sentence, realizing what she was about to say. Her face flushed red, and she looked away. Elijah caught it, but he didn't react. Instead, he nodded. "I see. Well, I think Mr. Wallace would appreciate knowing how his customers are being treated." "What's your name?" The woman's head snapped up, her eyes widening in panic. "I don't need to give you my name," she said quickly. "And like I said, we're closing." Elijah held her gaze for a long moment, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. The bell above the frame chimed softly as he stepped back into the street. The air outside felt cool against his skin, but the tightness in his chest lingered. He'd learned to let things like this roll off him, at least that's what he told himself. But no matter how successful or accomplished he became, moments like these left a mark. As he walked toward his car, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A text from his assistant reminding him of the community meeting tonight. Elijah paused, his gaze drifting back toward the boutique. Through the glass, the woman stood at the counter, visibly flustered, nervously glancing outside like she expected him to cause trouble. He let out a slow breath and turned back toward his car. There were bigger battles to fight tonight. He would stand in front of the Maple Grove Council and explain, for the third time, why his clinic mattered, why it deserved their full support. The pushback he'd received so far had been subtle, laced with coded words and polite rejections. But Elijah knew what it was. Old habits didn't die easily in Maple Grove, and neither did old prejudices. Elijah slid into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel as his mind replayed the woman's words. "Maybe you should try a place that's more your style." He exhaled slowly, his jaw tight. Years of success, decades of hard work. And yet moments like these made him feel like nothing had changed. He started the engine, letting the low hum of the car settle him. He had grown used to microaggressions, brushing them off like dust on his shoulder. But some days, they hit harder than others. Today was one of those days. He looked in the rearview mirror and gave himself a quiet nod. Stay focused. The Maple Grove Community Center was a modest building on the edge of town. A parking lot peppered with pickup trucks and sedans stretched before the entrance. Elijah had attended enough community meetings here to know what to expect. Polite smiles, hesitant nods, and the occasional question framed to sound reasonable but loaded with resistance. Inside, a mix of townsfolk gathered in folding chairs, murmuring quietly while flipping through printed agendas. At the front, a long table faced the room. Council members sat in a row. 5 middle-aged men and women, dressed in neutral tones. At the center sat Harold Kline, a longtime councilman, who, as Elijah had come to learn, rarely made decisions without first considering his own interests. Elijah walked in with a purposeful stride, dressed as he always was, polished but understated. Heads turned, and conversations quieted as people noticed him. He offered nods of acknowledgement, but the weight of their stares pressed on him. He knew the looks well. Some were curious, others guarded, but a few carried that familiar edge of suspicion. He took his seat in the front row, his back straight and his hands resting calmly on his knees. He could hear snippets of conversation behind him. "That's the guy funding the new clinic, right? Big money, I hear. Heard he's from here, but didn't stick around long, did he?" The murmurs were subtle, but Elijah had learned to hear between the lines. He focused on his breathing, the sound of his own heartbeat drowning out the whispers. Councilman Kline cleared his throat, tapping his microphone. "All right, let's call this meeting to order. First on the agenda, discussion on zoning approvals for the Hayes Community Health Center." Elijah rose and walked to the podium as Kline gestured for him to speak. The councilman's expression was carefully neutral, but Elijah could see the faintest hint of discomfort in his eyes. "Good evening," Elijah began, his voice clear and even. "For those of you I haven't met, I'm Dr. Elijah Hayes. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you again about the clinic." He paused, letting his gaze sweep over the room. "As you know, Maple Grove has been without a fully functional healthcare center for over a decade. Our clinic will provide affordable, quality care to families who need it most. From pediatric services to senior care, we've already hired medical staff ready to serve this community." As Elijah continued, he kept his tone calm and steady, outlining the clinic's benefits, jobs, resources, life-saving treatments. But as he spoke, he caught Harold Kline exchanging looks with the councilman to his right, a balding man with narrowed eyes. When Elijah finished, Kline leaned toward the microphone, his smile thin. "Thank you, Dr. Hayes, for your presentation. Very thorough." He flipped through the papers in front of him, dragging out the pause. "We've received your plans, but there are still concerns." "Concerns?" Elijah asked, his brow furrowing slightly. "Could you clarify?" Kline shifted in his seat. "Well, there's the matter of the traffic increase near that part of town, and I believe there are a few outstanding permits we need to look into." "Those permits have been approved," Elijah replied, keeping his voice measured. "Your office confirmed it last month." A ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd. Kline's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly. "Perhaps, but we still need to ensure that a project of this scale, especially one with such financial backing, doesn't disrupt the character of Maple Grove." There it was, the character of Maple Grove. Elijah's grip tightened on the sides of the podium, but his face remained composed. He had heard this argument before. "I'm here to help build up this town, not disrupt it," he said, his voice unwavering. "People here deserve access to healthcare without having to drive an hour out of town." Kline opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a voice from the back interrupted. "That's all well and good, but why now?" A man in a flannel jacket stood, arms crossed. "You've been off living in your big cities making money. Why are you suddenly so interested in us little folks?" Laughter, thin and uneasy, broke out among a few attendees. Elijah looked toward the man, his eyes calm but sharp. "I grew up here," he said simply. "I've never forgotten where I came from." "Could have fooled us," the man muttered, loud enough for others to hear. Elijah held back a sigh, his patience thinning. He scanned the council, watching as Kline leaned back, clearly enjoying the distraction. "Dr. Hayes," Kline said, clasping his hands together. "It's not that we don't appreciate your contributions, but some folks in the community are concerned. Big projects often bring unintended consequences. We need to be cautious." "Cautious?" Elijah repeated, his voice quiet but firm. "This town has needed a clinic for years. How much longer are you willing to let your neighbors suffer because of caution?" Kline's smile tightened, but before he could respond, a woman's voice rang out. "Is this really about permits and traffic, Harold?" The room turned to look at Dr. Evelyn Turner, who had entered quietly and now stood near the door. Her dark blazer and confident posture commanded attention. Kline's expression soured slightly. "Dr. Turner, we're in the middle of stalling," she cut in, walking to stand beside Elijah. "I've been following this process closely. Every concern brought up has been addressed, except the ones no one wants to say out loud." The room grew tense. Elijah glanced at Evelyn, a hint of gratitude in his eyes. She had always been one to speak bluntly when it mattered. "What are you implying?" Kline asked, though his tone suggested he knew exactly what she meant. Evelyn folded her arms. "We all know what's going on here. Dr. Hayes isn't being denied because of traffic concerns or paperwork. He's being stonewalled because certain people in this town have a problem with who he is and what he represents." The room erupted into murmurs and low exclamations. Kline slammed his gavel onto the table, his face flushed. "That's enough, Dr. Turner." Evelyn didn't flinch. "No, Harold, enough is pretending this isn't about race. Enough is letting bias stop progress. Elijah is trying to help this town, and you're too proud or too prejudiced to let him." Kline's face darkened, his composure cracking. "If you're going to make baseless accusations, this discussion is over." Elijah's voice cut through the noise, calm but commanding. "It's not over, Mr. Kline." The councilman looked at him sharply, but Elijah stepped forward, his shoulders squared. "You can delay this project, you can throw up every roadblock you can think of, but this clinic will open, with or without your support." The room fell silent. Kline stared at Elijah, his jaw tight, but said nothing. Elijah turned back to the crowd, his voice steady and clear. "This clinic isn't for me, it's for you, your children, your parents, your neighbors. Healthcare isn't a privilege, it's a right, and I will fight for it, no matter how many times I'm told to sit down." The silence that followed was heavy, but Elijah didn't waver. He met the eyes of those in the room, letting his words settle before stepping back from the podium. As he returned to his seat, Evelyn gave him a small nod of approval. Kline, meanwhile, looked visibly rattled, his hands gripping the edges of the table. Elijah knew this wasn't over. The meeting would adjourn, and Kline would find new ways to slow things down. But something had shifted in the room. The crowd had seen the truth. Some of them, for the first time, and Elijah was far from done fighting. Elijah leaned against the hood of his car in the parking lot outside the community center, the cool evening air doing little to calm the fire simmering inside him. The meeting was over, but its sting lingered. Councilman Kline had spent the better part of an hour pretending to consider the clinic's merits, all while finding every excuse to drag his feet. It was clear now, this wasn't about traffic or zoning, it was about something deeper, uglier. Evelyn stood beside him, arms crossed, her face tight with frustration. "Did you see the way Kline looked at us? He's not even trying to hide it anymore." Elijah nodded, his gaze fixed on the darkened horizon. "It's more than just him. He's got others backing him, or at least keeping quiet while he plays his games." "Cowards," Evelyn muttered. "Every last one of them." Before Elijah could respond, a loud, sharp voice cut through the quiet. "Dr. Hayes!" Elijah turned to see Harold Kline striding across the parking lot, flanked by none other than Officer Grayson, the same officer who'd built a reputation for targeting people who looked like Elijah. Grayson's broad shoulders and smug expression were unmistakable, the kind of man who wore his authority like a weapon. Evelyn stiffened beside Elijah. "What now?" she whispered. Elijah straightened his posture as Kline approached, his forced smile illuminated by the orange glow of a nearby streetlight. Grayson trailed behind, his hand resting casually on the holster at his side. "Evening, Dr. Hayes," Kline began, his voice dripping with false politeness. "I'm glad I caught you. There's been some concern raised about your involvement in the clinic project." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Concern?" Grayson chimed in before Kline could continue, his voice a low growl. "We received a report earlier today about suspicious activity at the old clinic site." Elijah frowned, confusion flashing across his face. "Suspicious activity? What are you talking about?" Kline's smile widened, but his eyes stayed cold. "Vandalism, some damage to the building exterior." "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Evelyn scoffed. "That's ridiculous. Why would Elijah vandalize his own clinic?" Grayson ignored her, his gaze locked onto Elijah. "We need to ask you a few questions, Dr. Hayes. Step over here, please." Elijah could feel the anger rising in his chest, but he tamped it down with a steady breath. "You're accusing me of vandalizing my own property. You can't be serious." Grayson took a step closer, his tone hardening. "I'm not accusing you of anything. But you're going to need to come with me to answer some questions." Elijah held his ground, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not going anywhere. If you have questions, you can ask them here." Grayson's hand twitched near his belt. "I'm not asking, Hayes. This is an order." Evelyn stepped forward, fire flashing in her eyes. "This is harassment, and you know it. You don't have a warrant, and you have no grounds to detain him." Grayson's lip curled. "Stay out of this, lady, unless you want to come too." Elijah looked between Grayson and Kline, his jaw tight. He could feel it, the trap closing in, the weight of years of systemic bias bearing down on him like a storm cloud. They didn't want answers. They wanted a spectacle, He spoke carefully, deliberately. "I'm not resisting anything, officer, but I know my rights, and I'm not going to stand here while you intimidate me for no reason." Kline folded his arms, watching with the dispassionate interest of a man who knew the outcome long before the game had begun. "You can make this easy, Dr. Hayes, or you can make it difficult." Evelyn was already pulling her phone from her pocket. "I'm recording this," she announced loudly, "so whatever you do next, I hope you're ready to defend it." Grayson turned on her with a sneer. "Put that away before you get yourself in trouble." Elijah raised a hand. "Evelyn, it's fine, let him do what he's going to do." Grayson's eyes lit up as though he'd won. "That's the smartest thing you've said all night." He grabbed Elijah's arm, yanking him forward with unnecessary force. "What are you doing?" Evelyn shouted. "This is unlawful!" Elijah stumbled slightly but didn't resist, even as Grayson wrenched his hands behind his back and snapped the cold steel of the handcuffs into place. The sound echoed through the empty parking lot like a gunshot. His pulse raced, but his expression remained calm. "This is unbelievable," Evelyn muttered, her phone trained on the scene. "You're arresting him without cause. This is illegal, and you're going to regret it." Kline watched in silence, satisfaction flickering across his face as Grayson led Elijah toward the squad car. Elijah met his gaze and saw the truth written plainly there. "This isn't about justice, it's about reminding you where you stand." Grayson shoved Elijah into the back seat of the cruiser, the door slamming shut with a sharp thud. From the small, cramped back seat, Elijah could see Evelyn pacing, still recording, her face pale with anger. The car started with a low rumble, the radio crackling as Grayson muttered something unintelligible. Elijah's mind raced. It wasn't just the arrest, it was what came next. A mugshot in the papers, rumors spreading through the town, whispers that the big, important Dr. Hayes was just another man with handcuffs on his wrists. They didn't need a conviction to ruin him. The accusation alone would be enough. He closed his eyes, steadying himself. "Think, stay calm. This is just another battle." The squad car stopped outside the Maple Grove police station, an aging brick building that looked as tired as the system it represented. Grayson yanked open the door and grabbed Elijah's arm, hauling him out. Roughly, Elijah didn't resist, though every muscle in his body screamed with frustration. Inside, the station was dimly lit and eerily quiet. A few officers glanced up as Grayson led Elijah through the lobby, their expressions ranging from curiosity to indifference. None of them spoke. Grayson shoved him into a chair near the front desk, his voice dripping with false authority. "Sit tight. You'll have your chance to explain." Elijah didn't respond. He wouldn't give Grayson the satisfaction of seeing him angry. Instead, he focused on the slow tick of the clock above the desk, counting each second as it passed. He thought about his clinic, the community he'd returned to serve, and the countless lives his work could save. "They can't stop me," he told himself. "They won't stop me." Across the room, the front door swung open, and a familiar voice called out, "What the hell is going on here?" Elijah turned to see Mitchell Foster, the town's deputy mayor, striding in with a face like thunder. Mitchell had always been one of the few officials in town who seemed to genuinely believe in Elijah's work, though his support often wavered under pressure. Grayson stood straighter, his hand still resting on his holster. "Evening, Mr. Foster. Just handling a situation." Mitchell's gaze snapped to Elijah, his expression darkening. "You're telling me Dr. Hayes is the situation? What is he doing here?" "Suspicious activity," Grayson replied flatly. Mitchell's eyes narrowed. "Suspicious activity? My ass! You dragged a man into custody without a shred of evidence. Are you out of your mind?" Grayson opened his mouth to argue, but Mitchell held up a hand, silencing him. "Get those cuffs off him now." Grayson hesitated, his jaw tightening. "With all due respect." "Now," Mitchell repeated, his voice hard. "Unless you want my office to call the governor and explain why one of the country's most respected doctors is sitting in your station for no reason." Grayson's face burned red with anger, but he complied. Unlocking the handcuffs with jerky movements, Elijah rubbed his wrists, the faint sting of the metal a reminder of how close things had come to spiraling out of control. Mitchell turned to Elijah, his voice lowering. "Are you all right?" Elijah nodded, though his pride was bruised and his patience frayed. "I'm fine." Mitchell shot Grayson one last glare. "This isn't over. You'll answer for this." Grayson said nothing, his eyes cold as they met Elijah's. Elijah held his gaze for a moment longer before turning to Mitchell. "Thank you," he said quietly, "but I won't let this go either." Mitchell gave a tight nod. "You shouldn't." Elijah straightened his shoulders, his resolve hardening like steel. This wasn't just about a clinic anymore, it was about something bigger, something that had been festering beneath the surface of Maple Grove for far too long, and Elijah was ready to tear it wide open. Elijah stepped out of the police station into the chill of the evening air, rubbing his wrists where the cuffs had bitten into his skin. Mitchell walked beside him, his face a storm cloud of anger and embarrassment. "This shouldn't have happened," Mitchell muttered, his voice low but heated. "I'll speak with the chief. Grayson's actions were completely out of line." Elijah stopped walking and turned to him, his calm, deliberate voice cutting through Mitchell's words. "And then what? A slap on the wrist, a memo. This isn't just Grayson, Mitchell, you know that as well as I do." Mitchell shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Elijah's gaze. "It's complicated." "Of course it's complicated," Elijah shot back. "That's the problem. I didn't come back to Maple Grove to fight these battles, but I'll be damned if I let this system bury me or my clinic." Mitchell hesitated, glancing around the darkened parking lot. He lowered his voice, as if someone might be listening. "Elijah, you need to be careful. Pushing too hard will only make them dig their heels in. Kline isn't the kind of man who likes to lose, and Grayson, well, you saw for yourself." "I don't need to be careful, Mitchell," Elijah said firmly. "I need to be right, and I need to fight." Mitchell sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Look, I'll do what I can from my end, but you're making enemies here. Big ones. Just watch your back." Without another word, Mitchell turned and walked to his car, leaving Elijah standing alone under the flickering streetlight. Elijah looked down at his hands, the faint redness from the cuffs still visible. His resolve hardened. This wasn't just about a clinic anymore, it was about power, about who got to decide who belonged, and who didn't. The next morning, Elijah arrived at the clinic site earlier than usual. The building sat empty, its fresh coat of paint glowing softly in the early light. It was a symbol of everything he'd worked for, everything Maple Grove deserved, and yet, it already felt under siege. As Elijah unlocked the door, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. "Evelyn." "I was just about to call you," Elijah said, answering the call. "Have you seen the news?" Evelyn's voice was sharp, frantic. Elijah frowned. "What news?" "Turn on Channel 5 now." Elijah's chest tightened as he rushed to the clinic's small break room. A dusty old TV sat in the corner, and after fumbling with the remote, the screen flickered to life. The local news anchor appeared, her expression somber. Behind her was a photo of the clinic, vandalized, spray-painted words slashing across the pristine white walls. "Go back where you came from." Elijah's stomach dropped. The Hayes Community Health Center, set to open in a few weeks, was defaced last night in what authorities are calling a suspected act of vandalism, the anchor reported. No suspects have been identified, but local officials are investigating. Evelyn's voice crackled through the phone. "It's Grayson and Kline, it has to be." Elijah didn't respond immediately. He couldn't tear his eyes from the screen, from the hateful words scrawled across the building. It was as if someone had taken all the quiet resistance he'd felt, the stares, the coded words, the doubts, and turned them into something physical, something ugly. "I'll call you back," he said quietly, hanging up. He stepped out of the clinic and stared at the wall, his jaw tight as anger bubbled in his chest. A crowd was beginning to gather, passers-by who had stopped to gawk, murmuring among themselves. A man in a baseball cap muttered loud enough for Elijah to hear. "Well, what do you expect coming in here? Acting like he owns the place." Elijah's hands curled into fists, but he forced himself to breathe. He had fought bigger battles than this, on operating tables, in boardrooms, and in his own mind, he wouldn't let them win. Behind him, a voice called out, "Dr. Hayes!" Elijah turned to see Evelyn jogging toward him, her face etched with worry. She stopped beside him, looking up at the hateful graffiti. "Unbelievable," she breathed. "They're getting desperate." Elijah didn't answer. He stared at the vandalized wall for another long moment, then turned to Evelyn, his voice steady. "Call a press conference." "What?" Evelyn blinked. "You want to—" "Call a press conference," he repeated. "If they want to drag me down in the dark, we're going to shine a light on them." Evelyn stared at him for a beat, then nodded. "I'll make the calls." By noon, news crews, townspeople, and curious onlookers had gathered in front of the clinic. The hateful graffiti was still visible, a jarring backdrop against the bright midday sun. Elijah stood on the steps of the clinic, flanked by Evelyn and a few members of his staff. Cameras clicked and buzzed as reporters jostled for position. Councilman Kline stood near the back of the crowd, arms folded across his chest, his face unreadable. Officer Grayson wasn't far behind, leaning casually against his patrol car, a smug smirk on his face. Elijah stepped up to the microphone, his face calm but resolute. The crowd quieted. "Good afternoon," he began, his deep voice carrying over the murmurs. "For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Elijah Hayes. I grew up here in Maple Grove. This is my home." He paused, letting the words sink in. "This clinic behind me represents years of hard work, not just from me, but from countless others who believe in providing quality healthcare to those who need it most. It's a place meant to serve this community, to save lives, to bring hope." Elijah turned slightly, gesturing to the vandalized wall. "But last night, someone tried to take that hope away. This isn't just paint, this is hate, this is fear, and this—" He looked out over the crowd, his eyes narrowing. "This is what happens when good people say nothing." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Kline's face twitched, but he said nothing. "I won't be intimidated," Elijah continued. "I won't be silenced, and this clinic will open, no matter how many roadblocks are put in its path." The cameras whirred, capturing his every word. He looked directly at Kline, his voice ringing with quiet defiance. "To those who think they can scare me into walking away, you don't know me. I face far worse than spray paint on a wall, and I'll be here long after it's gone." A ripple of applause broke out from the crowd, growing louder as more people joined in. Kline's face darkened as he turned to leave, muttering something to the man beside him. Officer Grayson remained, his smirk fading as he stared at Elijah, a flash of something like uncertainty crossing his face. Evelyn stepped closer to Elijah as the applause died down. "You think that'll change anything?" she whispered. Elijah's gaze didn't waver. "It's a start." Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elijah sat in his office at the clinic, staring out the window. The graffiti had been cleaned, but the words still burned in his mind. "Go back where you came from." There was a knock at the door. Evelyn entered, holding a file folder. "You need to see this." Elijah took the folder, his brow furrowing as he flipped it open. Inside were documents, zoning complaints, building code violations, and a list of names. At the bottom, one name stood out: Harold Kline. "This isn't just pushback, Elijah," Evelyn said quietly. "Kline's been working with developers. They want the land your clinic's on. This was never about traffic or permits, it's about money." Elijah's stomach tightened as he read the documents. "And Grayson? He's been covering for Kline, keeping you distracted while they pull strings behind the scenes." Elijah closed the folder, his hand steady despite the anger building inside him. "Then it's time we stop playing defense." "What are you going to do?" Evelyn asked. Elijah looked up, his eyes sharp. "Expose them, every single one of them." Elijah stood in the shadows of his clinic's doorway, his gaze fixed on the flickering street lamp across the road. The empty streets of Maple Grove were quiet. Too quiet. He knew what he was about to do would rattle this town to its core, but that was exactly what needed to happen. The truth was a storm, and Elijah was ready to let it tear through every facade and falsehood. He checked his watch. 10:32 p.m. Evelyn had gone home hours earlier, though reluctantly. "If you're planning something, don't go in alone," she had warned. Elijah assured her it was fine. But deep down, he knew this was something he needed to face himself. He didn't wait long. Headlights appeared at the end of the street, bright against the darkness. The patrol car slowed as it approached, rolling to a stop directly in front of the clinic. Elijah stepped into the light, his calm presence cutting through the tension in the air. Officer Grayson stepped out of the vehicle, his boots heavy on the pavement. He wasn't wearing his usual smirk tonight. there was something harder in his expression. Something dangerous. For a moment, the only sound was the soft crackle of Grayson's radio. He turned toward Elijah, his hand already resting on his belt. "Dr. Hayes," Grayson drawled, his voice cutting through the night air. "What are you doing out here at this hour?" Elijah didn't move. "Waiting for you." Grayson cocked his head, the faint glow of the streetlight casting a shadow across his face. "Is that right? Why's that?" "I wanted to give you a chance," Elijah said, his tone even but deliberate. "A chance to do the right thing before this goes any further." Grayson laughed, the sound low and humorless. "You're really something. You know that, walking around town like you own the place, pretending like you're better than the rest of us." Elijah stepped closer, his shoulders squared. "I don't pretend anything, officer. I'm here to help this town, to help the people who need it." Grayson's face twisted. "You don't belong here, Hayes. You think we don't know who you really are, flashing your money around, stirring up trouble. People like you don't build things. You take, and I'm not going to let that happen to Maple Grove." There it was. The truth, ugly and unfiltered, spilling out like poison. Elijah stared at him, unflinching. "What exactly am I taking? Officer A building no one wanted, lives that no one else cared about saving? Or is it something else, your illusion of control?" Grayson's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenching tight. "Watch your mouth." "No," Elijah said firmly, his voice rising. "You watch yours for weeks. You've harassed me, arrested me without cause, and now you've tried to destroy what I've built. But I know what this is about. It's not about the clinic. It's not about me. It's about your fear. You're afraid of change. Afraid of seeing someone like me stand where you think I don't belong." Grayson took a step forward, his hand gripping his baton. "You're out of line." "And you're out of time," Elijah countered. "I have proof, Grayson, proof of what you and Kline have been doing." Grayson froze. The confidence in his posture faltered. For just a moment, Elijah pressed on. "I know about the backroom deals, the developers, the money Kline's been funneling into his own pockets, and I know how you've been covering for him, using your badge to intimidate anyone who steps in your way." Grayson's face flushed red, his breathing quickening. "You don't know a damn thing." "Don't I?" Elijah said. "You underestimated me, officer. You thought I'd back down, you thought I'd run, but I'm not leaving. I sent everything, every document, every file, to the state attorney's office tonight. By morning, it'll all be public." Grayson's expression hardened into something cold and dangerous. "You think you've won?" Elijah held his gaze. "I didn't come here to win, I came here to do what's right. You've spent your life tearing people like me down, but this time, you're going to answer for it." For a long moment, neither man moved. The air was thick, crackling with tension. Then Grayson lunged. Elijah saw it coming. A flash of motion as Grayson reached for him. Years of discipline and quick thinking kicked in. Elijah sidestepped just in time, Grayson's momentum carrying him forward. He stumbled, but recovered quickly, rage flashing across his face. "Don't make this worse for yourself," Elijah said sharply, his voice commanding. But Grayson wasn't listening. He charged again, his baton raised. This time, Elijah caught his wrist mid-swing, gripping it with surprising strength. Grayson grunted, twisting against him, but Elijah held firm. "You want to fight me?" Elijah said, his voice steady but edged with steel. "You'll lose." The sound of tires screeching broke the struggle. Another vehicle skidded to a stop behind Grayson's patrol car. A door slammed, and a voice rang out. "Grayson, stand down!" Both men froze. Grayson turned sharply to see Chief Daniels, the head of the Maple Grove Police Department, storming toward them. His face was dark with fury, his voice carrying across the empty street. "What the hell is going on here?" Daniels barked. His eyes darted between Elijah and Grayson, landing on Grayson's baton still clutched in his hand. "Put that away now." Grayson hesitated, his knuckles white around the handle. "Chief, I said put it away," Daniels snapped. Grayson's shoulders fell as he let the baton drop to his side. Daniels turned to Elijah, his expression unreadable. "Are you all right, Dr. Hayes?" Elijah straightened his posture, brushing dust from his sleeve. "I'm fine." Daniels' gaze shifted back to Grayson, and his tone dropped dangerously low. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but this ends tonight I just got off the phone with the state attorney's office. They're launching an investigation into Kline. You're implicated, Grayson. Grayson's face paled. What? That's not possible. It's more than possible, Daniel said. It's happening, and after what I just saw, you're suspended until further notice. Grayson looked at Elijah, his expression a mix of rage and disbelief. You did this, he spat. You think you can come in here and ruin us? Elijah didn't flinch. I didn't ruin you. You did that yourself. Grayson opened his mouth to speak, but Daniels cut him off. Get out of here, Grayson, now. Grayson shot one last venomous look at Elijah before stalking to his patrol car. The engine roared to life, and moments later, he was gone, the echo of his tires fading into the night. Daniels turned back to Elijah, his expression softening slightly. You've made some powerful enemies tonight. Elijah met his gaze, unshaken. I'm not afraid of them. Daniels sighed, as if wrestling with his own conscience. For what it's worth, I'm sorry it came to this. But you should watch yourself, Dr. Hayes. This town doesn't change easily. Then I'll just have to work harder, Elijah replied. Daniels studied him for a long moment before nodding. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his car, leaving Elijah alone in the street once more. Elijah took a deep breath, the tension in his chest slowly releasing. He glanced up at the clinic, its walls clean and bright under the streetlight, a beacon of what was possible. For the first time in weeks, he felt something close to hope. The fight wasn't over, far from it, but tonight, he had taken the first real step toward change. And he wasn't going to stop. The air was thick with tension as Elijah stood outside his clinic, the heavy weight of the night pressing down on him. He had been preparing for this moment for weeks. He knew it was coming, the showdown, the final confrontation with the forces that had been trying to shut him down. His clinic, his dream for the people of Maple Grove, had been under constant attack, from the subtle sabotage to the overt acts of racism. Tonight, it was going to end one way or another. The street was quiet. Too quiet. The lights from his clinic reflected off the dark pavement, casting long shadows. Elijah's pulse quickened, the adrenaline sharpening his senses. He could hear the faint sound of tires crunching on gravel before the patrol car pulled up in front of the clinic. The door of the car slammed open, and out stepped Officer Grayson, the same man who had been a constant thorn in Elijah's side. Behind him was Harold Kline, the town's corrupt councilman, his hands tucked into his coat pockets, like a man who didn't care about anything except maintaining his hold on power. Elijah had known for a while that Kline was behind much of the opposition. But tonight was different. Tonight, the truth was coming out. Grayson didn't even bother to mask his disdain as he eyed Elijah. You're still here. Thought you'd have run by now. People like you don't belong in places like this. Elijah took a deep breath, his voice calm but filled with authority. You're wrong, Grayson. I fought for this town, for these people my whole life. I'm not going anywhere. Grayson scoffed, stepping closer, his eyes narrowing. You think you can change things here? The town's better off without your clinic, your so-called help. Kline stepped forward, his smirk barely visible in the dim light. You've stirred up too much trouble, Dr. Hayes. It's time for you to leave. You're not welcome here. Elijah's eyes flashed. And how long did you think you could get away with it, Kline? The shady deals, the under-the-table money you're using the police, the town's resources to push your agenda, but you're about to get exposed. Kline's face darkened, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. You think you can stop me? I've been running this town for decades. People like you are always looking to tear things down, but I always come out on top. Grayson, emboldened by Kline's words, took a step forward, puffing out his chest. You're nothing but a troublemaker, Hayes. All you've done is come in here and stir the pot. People are scared of change. They want things to stay the way they are. Elijah's gaze hardened. That's the problem, Grayson. You've spent your life telling people what to fear. What you don't understand is that change is inevitable, and I'm not backing down. Not now, not ever. The tension between them thickened, a palpable force hanging in the air. Elijah could feel the sweat on his palms, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the moment, the showdown he had been preparing for. Do you think people will support you? Kline sneered. You're one man against all of us. You don't stand a chance. Elijah took a deep breath, steadying himself. It's never been about standing alone, it's about standing for what's right, and people are tired of the corruption you've been feeding them. They're not afraid anymore. At that moment, Mitchell, the deputy mayor, pulled up in his car. He stepped out, a grim expression on his face as he walked toward the group. "Mitchell," Kline said, his tone dripping with condescension. "I see you're here to support the troublemaker. You really think the people will stand behind him after all this?" Mitchell didn't flinch. "No, Harold, I think they'll stand behind what's right. And I'm done being quiet while you use this town for your own gain." Kline's face twisted in rage. "You don't know who you're messing with, Mitchell. You'll regret this." Elijah could see the shift in Mitchell's eyes. He had made up his mind. The choice had been made, and the truth was starting to spill out in the open. Kline and Grayson were no longer in control of the narrative. They were exposed, their actions slowly but surely coming to light. "Tonight, Harold," Mitchell said, his voice steady, "the truth comes out. The state attorney's office has everything, every document, every backdoor deal, and the people, they know the truth now. This is over." Kline's smirk faltered for the first time. "You think I'm going to let you take this from me? Do you have any idea who I am?" "I know exactly who you are," Elijah replied, stepping forward, his voice ringing with conviction. "You're the person who's been holding this town back, but not anymore." Grayson stepped in front of Kline, his hand on his gun. "You don't know what you're getting into, Hayes," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You think you can just waltz in here and change everything? You're not leaving this clinic in one piece." Elijah didn't flinch. He had seen worse in his life. The harshest battles weren't fought with fists, they were fought with words, with truth, and with determination. He stood tall, his eyes locked on Grayson. "You're done, Grayson," Elijah said firmly. "You can't intimidate me anymore. You can't shut me down. You're on the wrong side of history, and when the people of this town see what you've been doing, they're not going to stand for it." Grayson's grip tightened around his gun, but Kline raised a hand, stopping him. "Enough!" Kline spat. "We don't need to do this here." Elijah's heart pounded, but his resolve only strengthened. "This is where it ends, Kline. I've already sent the evidence to the attorney's office. By morning, everything will be public. Your dirty dealings will come to light." Kline's eyes widened for a split second, just enough to see the cracks in his armor. The man who had controlled everything for so long was finally losing his grip. "You can't stop what's coming," Elijah continued, his voice unwavering. "You've lost." Kline looked from Elijah to Mitchell, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "You think you've won? This town belongs to people like me, people who know how to keep it running. You're just a speck in the dirt. You're nothing." "No," Elijah said, his voice cutting through the night. "I'm not nothing. I'm everything you've tried to suppress." The ground beneath them seemed to shift, the power dynamic changing in real time. Elijah could feel the weight of the moment, the sheer force of truth rising. This was the tipping point, but just as Elijah thought they might have won, the distant sound of sirens cut through the air. "You think that's going to save you?" Kline scoffed. "You're too late. There's nothing you can do to stop it." But Elijah wasn't backing down. "I'm not afraid of what you can do anymore, Kline. You don't control me, you don't control this town. The people are awake now, and they're ready to stand with me." The sirens grew louder, and Elijah knew the game was shifting. The pieces were in motion. The stakes had never been higher. Kline and Grayson were exposed, but the full consequences of their actions were still unfolding. As the sirens grew closer, Elijah's gaze never wavered from Kline. The words that had been building up inside him for so long were finally spilling out, and there was no going back now. The sirens blared in the distance, a symbol of impending change, but for a moment, it felt like time itself had stopped. Elijah stood in front of his clinic, facing down Harold Kline and Officer Grayson, the weight of the confrontation pressing in on him. His hands were steady, his pulse pounding in his ears, but inside, a storm was brewing. The truth was now out, and he knew it was only a matter of time before the town's long-standing power structure began to unravel. As the flashing lights of the police cars illuminated the street, Grayson's hand hovered nervously over his holster, his face a mix of uncertainty and defiance. Kline, on the other hand, appeared more rattled than Elijah had ever seen him. The councilman's facade of control was slipping. cracks showing in the armor that had kept him in power for so long. It was clear now that Elijah wasn't just a nuisance. He was the force that could take everything Kline had built down with a single blow. The 2 patrol cars screeched to a halt in front of the clinic, and several officers piled out, eyes scanning the scene. One of them, Officer Harris, was the only one Elijah had ever trusted in the department. He had always been professional and open to listening. Unlike the others, Elijah caught Harris's eye, a subtle nod that spoke volumes. This wasn't just about Elijah anymore. It was about a town waking up to the corruption it had been blind to for years. Harris moved toward Elijah with purpose. "We have everything. The files, the bank statements, the witnesses," he said quietly, but loud enough for Kline and Grayson to hear. "Kline, Grayson, your reign ends tonight. You're done." Kline's face twisted in fury, but there was no escape now. The forces Elijah had set in motion were too powerful, too undeniable. With a final glance at Grayson, Kline turned on his heel and began to walk briskly toward the street. But as he did, he realized the crowd that had gathered. Ordinary citizens of Maple Grove, many of whom had once been too afraid to speak up, were standing there, watching him, their eyes full of judgment. The people knew now, and they weren't going to let Kline slither away. Grayson, still holding his ground, muttered a curse under his breath. "This isn't over, Hayes," he said, voice low with a venomous promise. But even as he spoke, his power, his authority, seemed to evaporate with every passing second. Elijah knew it wasn't just the law that was closing in on them. The people had spoken. They had chosen their side. Kline's car sped off into the night, fleeing the scene as if he could outrun the consequences of his actions. The sound of his tires fading into the distance marked the beginning of the end for his reign over Maple Grove. As the officers moved in to take Grayson into custody, Elijah's attention shifted to the crowd that had gathered, faces he recognized. Doctors, teachers, shop owners, and even the elderly now stood as a united front against the corruption that had poisoned their town for so long. Their quiet nods of approval and murmurs of encouragement gave Elijah a sense of peace he hadn't realized he'd been craving. Mitchell stepped forward, his face resolute, but also filled with relief. "You did it," he said, offering a handshake. "You changed everything." Elijah took his hand, firm and steady. "We did it, all of us." There was still much to be done. The fight wasn't over, and Elijah knew that there would be legal battles ahead, people who would try to undermine what they had accomplished. But it was a victory that came at great cost, but had also set the stage for something larger. With Grayson in handcuffs, and Kline's escape only a temporary reprieve, Elijah stood on the steps of his clinic, the gathering crowd before him, waiting for his next move. But this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about them. The community had spoken. The truth had been brought to light, and for once, it was the corrupt who were in the shadows, not the people they had long tried to silence. Days later, the town hall meeting had been called to address the aftermath of the night's events, news of Kline's flight, of Grayson's arrest, and of the wide-reaching implications of Elijah's actions had spread like wildfire through Maple Grove. A mix of hope and uncertainty hung in the air as the townspeople gathered in the old, familiar meeting hall. A few faces were still skeptical, but many were relieved, eager to move forward. Elijah sat in the front row, his gaze fixed on the podium where Mitchell now stood, giving a speech about the changes that would come. The mayor, who had been a passive participant in Kline's schemes, had resigned under pressure, and a new election was set to take place. Reform was on the horizon, and Elijah knew it would be a long road. The power Kline had amassed wasn't going to dissipate overnight, but the town had turned a page. Elijah's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Sarah, his longtime colleague at the clinic. "Got the grants approved, the state's on board, we can rebuild, they're behind us." A smile tugged at his lips as he typed back, "This is just the beginning. We're going to make this town better." As Mitchell wrapped up his speech, Elijah stood, his presence commanding the room. He wasn't the loudest, but his silence spoke volumes. He had been through the fire, and now he was standing tall, not as a victim, but as a leader. "Thank you, Mitchell," Elijah said, as he made his way to the front. "But I think it's time the people of Maple Grove take control of their future. It's not just about changing the system, It's about building a new one, together. The applause that followed was louder than he had expected. The weight of the past few weeks had been heavy on his shoulders, but the sense of victory was sweet. As he turned to leave the meeting hall, he caught sight of Harris in the back. The officer nodded in acknowledgement, a silent promise that the fight for justice would continue. The sirens blared in the distance, a symbol of impending change. But for a moment, it felt like time itself had stopped. Elijah stood in front of his clinic, facing down Harold Kline and Officer Grayson, the weight of the confrontation pressing in on him. His hands were steady, his pulse pounding in his ears, but inside, a storm was brewing. The truth was now out, and he knew it was only a matter of time before the town's long-standing power structure began to unravel. As the flashing lights of the police cars illuminated the street, Grayson's hand hovered nervously over his holster, his face a mix of uncertainty and defiance. Kline, on the other hand, appeared more rattled than Elijah had ever seen him. The councilman's facade of control was slipping, cracks showing in the armor that had kept him in power for so long. It was clear now that Elijah wasn't just a nuisance, he was the force that could take everything Kline had built down with a single blow. The two patrol cars screeched to a halt in front of the clinic, and several officers piled out, eyes scanning the scene. One of them, Officer Harris, was the only one Elijah had ever trusted in the department. He had always been professional and open to listening. Unlike the others, Elijah caught Harris's eye, a subtle nod that spoke volumes. This wasn't just about Elijah anymore. It was about a town waking up to the corruption it had been blind to for years. Harris moved toward Elijah with purpose. "We have everything. The files, the bank statements, the witnesses," he said quietly, but loud enough for Kline and Grayson to hear. "Kline, Grayson, your reign ends tonight. You're done." Kline's face twisted in fury, but there was no escape now. The forces Elijah had set in motion were too powerful, too undeniable. With a final glance at Grayson, Kline turned on his heel and began to walk briskly toward the street. But as he did, he realized the crowd that had gathered, ordinary citizens of Maple Grove, many of whom had once been too afraid to speak up, were standing there, watching him, their eyes full of judgment. The people knew now, and they weren't going to let Kline slither away. Grayson, still holding his ground, muttered a curse under his breath. "This isn't over, Hayes," he said, voice low with a venomous promise. But even as he spoke, his power, his authority, seemed to evaporate with every passing second. Elijah knew it wasn't just the law that was closing in on them. The people had spoken. They had chosen their side. Kline's car sped off into the night, fleeing the scene as if he could outrun the consequences of his actions. The sound of his tires fading into the distance marked the beginning of the end for his reign over Maple Grove. As the officers moved in to take Grayson into custody, Elijah's attention shifted to the crowd that had gathered, faces he recognized. Doctors, teachers, shop owners, and even the elderly now stood as a united front against the corruption that had poisoned their town for so long. Their quiet nods of approval and murmurs of encouragement gave Elijah a sense of peace he hadn't realized he'd been craving. Mitchell stepped forward, his face resolute, but also filled with relief. "You did it," he said, offering a handshake. "You changed everything." Elijah took his hand, firm and steady. "We did it, all of us." There was still much to be done. The fight wasn't over, and Elijah knew that there would be legal battles ahead, people who would try to undermine what they had accomplished. But it was a victory that came at great cost, but had also set the stage for something larger. With Grayson in handcuffs and Kline's escape only a temporary reprieve, Elijah stood on the steps of his clinic, the gathering crowd before him, waiting for his next move. But this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about them. The community had spoken. The truth had been brought to light, and for once, it was the corrupt who were in the shadows, not the people they had long tried to silence. Days later, the town hall meeting had been called to address the aftermath of the night's events. News of Kline's flight, of Grayson's arrest, and of the wide-reaching implications of Elijah's actions had spread like wildfire through Maple Grove. A mix of hope and uncertainty hung in the air as the townspeople gathered in the old, familiar meeting hall. A few faces were still skeptical, but many were relieved, eager to move forward. Elijah sat in the front row, his gaze fixed on the podium where Mitchell now stood, giving a speech about the changes that would come. The mayor, who had been a passive participant in Kline's schemes, had resigned under pressure, and a new election was set to take place. Reform was on the horizon, and Elijah knew it would be a long road. The power Kline had amassed wasn't going to dissipate overnight, but the town had turned a page. Elijah's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Sarah, his longtime colleague at the clinic. "Got the grants approved, the state's on board, we can rebuild, they're behind us." A smile tugged at his lips as he typed back, "This is just the beginning. We're going to make this town better." As Mitchell wrapped up his speech, Elijah stood, his presence commanding the room. He wasn't the loudest, but his silence spoke volumes. He had been through the fire, and now, he was standing tall, not as a victim, but as a leader. "Thank you, Mitchell," Elijah said as he made his way to the front. "But I think it's time the people of Maple Grove take control of their future. It's not just about changing the system, it's about building a new one, together." The applause that followed was louder than he had expected. The weight of the past few weeks had been heavy on his shoulders, but the sense of victory was sweet. As he turned to leave the meeting hall, he caught sight of Harris in the back. The officer nodded in acknowledgement, a silent promise that the fight for justice would continue. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over Maple Grove, Elijah stood alone outside his clinic, the building now a symbol of hope rather than defiance. He had fought for what he believed in, against corruption, against prejudice, and for the people who had too long been silenced. The road ahead was uncertain, but Elijah had learned something invaluable. Resilience wasn't just about surviving, it was about using every experience, every injustice, to fuel the change you wanted to see. The small town of Maple Grove had been shaken to its core, but as Elijah looked out over the quiet streets, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just the end of one battle, it was the beginning of something bigger, a movement for change that would ripple through the community for years to come. And though the fight was far from over, Elijah knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. He took a deep breath, his heart calm but full of determination. "We're just getting started,"